But what you need now is different to what we needed then. That element is completely missing out of the cabin crew syllabus. So this whole concept that it's less effective doing it remotely was an assumption.
The effectiveness of cabin crew training, you mentioned this is something that a topic that sort of is close to your heart, and the CRM aspect especially. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this particular aspect.
Okay, so the whole concept of this started really immediately post-COVID, when a lot of CRM training and a lot of training in general, actually, because of the COVID restrictions, was required to be done rather than being in a classroom, face-to-face, interactive, was now being done online through Teams, through Zoom, through whatever medium was available. And there was a lot of discussions amongst the industry about, was it effective training, where you've got, people sat at home in their pajamas or, still in bed. You've got people doing the hoovering whilst they're on their training course. And so, there was a lot of discussion about the effectiveness of training, and the guidance that we had from the regulator is that, okay, we kind of need, in order to make a fundamental change to regulation, there needs to be a driver. So therefore, we need to fundamentally evidence that delivering training this way is either ineffective or certainly less effective than what it was done before. So then entered this discussion as to, okay, well, how do we measure that? So we sort of had this big discussion with an industry forum, with the Flight Ops Human Factors Advisory Panel, and said, how do operators measure the effectiveness of their CRM training? How do they measure it pre-COVID, and how do we measure it post-COVID? And then all of a sudden it transpired that the way the regulations are written, that we actually don't. So this whole concept that it's less effective doing it remotely was an assumption rather than evidential. So this sparked a real thinks bubble in me, and thinking, well, actually that's really interesting, because having been forced down this road of looking at how we measure our effectiveness, and in the cabin crew regulation in particular, there's a statement in there that actually says you don't test CRM training. It actually says you have to do a knowledge check for all the subjects except for CRM. And I thought that was a bit odd. So that then sparked, sort of a wider sort of thought, really, and sort of looking as, well, why? Why do we not have to assess knowledge and understanding of this if it's so integral to everything that we do?
And what path did that take you on?
Well, firstly, I was quite shocked in the regulation to see this very clear statement that said, they should be assessed on everything within this subpart except CRM training. But later on, I then did a comparator between the relevant flight crew regulations, so for the pilots, and the cabin crew regulations, and I did sort of like a mapping exercise where you map them across. And the pilots have got a separate section dedicated to the assessment of CRM skills, so that applied activity, those behaviours, how do you actually conduct yourself within the operational environment? Do you demonstrate these behaviours, these skills, etc.? But that element is completely missing out of the cabin crew syllabus. It's not there at all. So not only does the regulation state don't test it at the basic level, but don't assess the application of it either, which then made me think, well, why are we required? Why do the regulations require us to train something? And it's a lot of time, it's a lot of effort. You need to have the instructors qualified to do it. The syllabus changes every year because of the way that it's done. And yet you're not required to evaluate its effectiveness. So, how does the organisation get value for money out of this training, really?
How would we go about measuring it if we did want to measure it? You mentioned, drafting the learning regulations.
Yep.
In a structured format. So let's get into that aspect of it.
Well, I do need to be careful, because
of course,
if it's not in the regulation, I can't endorse anything. However, we could use the word could. So the model that we look at in the presentation, if you do a Google search for measuring training effectiveness, the industry standard baseline is called the Kirkpatrick Model of training evaluation, and it measures it on 4 levels. And at the moment, we probably measure at level 1, which is basically a course feedback form. Do they enjoy the course? We should, and I use that word should, we should measure it at level 4, which is the benefit to the organisation, but that's another conversation that stems from another part of the regulation. But the bit in between, which do they actually, do the candidates remember? So level 2 is learning. Do they remember what they've been taught in the course? And that would traditionally be with, an exam or an assignment or some way of measuring that is absent. That's not there. And then the next level is the behavioural element of do they then apply that learning in the working environment? And again, that bit is missing. So the way that we look at it in the presentation is that you could do these things. Just because the regulation doesn't require you to, you could consider setting an exam. I think that would be a very, very unpopular notion, personally, both from the organisation and from the personnel. But on the flip side of that, a halfway house, one of the things that you could look at is imagine that you had to set an exam. So you don't have to set the exam, but when you're writing your training materials, if you imagine that you had to set an exam at the end of it, it forces you to write your course in a very specific way, and it forces you to be more objective. So you wouldn't set an exam at the end of it, but when you're developing the materials, imagine that you had to set the exam. And then from the behavioural side of things, then, could you introduce these assessments into things like line checks or line training, for example, actually on board the aircraft itself? I think doing it in routinely day-to-day doesn't really work in the way the aviation industry functions, to be honest with you. So we'd need to adapt that element slightly. But actually, introducing very, very specific things to look for in annual line checks actually is something that could be considered. And the benefit to that is that you could give a very, very clear indicator to the organisation of the value of this training, because if you want to keep the resources and you want to keep the time available and do the best you possibly can, being able to evidence to the operator that this is all worth it. Look, this is what we've achieved over the last 6, 12, 18 months, however long your review cycle is, would be really, really beneficial for the training department's perspective.
So you're saying even if it's not regulated, the organizations would still get far better value if they just rewrote the way they would
I call it compliance plus.
Right.
Compliance is the minimum, but compliance plus, you can always do more. When you look at performance-based regulation principles, actually, you can always do better. And I don't mean that from, it's sort of like, you must do better. But, if there is something that you could do better, then that will be looked on favourably by the regulator.
Helen, so you've got airline experience, you've got the academic experience, you've got now a ringside view to the way a new generation is coming in.
Yeah.
Just want to understand your thoughts on a new generation, very different from those that preceded it, access to enormous amounts of information, unprecedented in human history. With what we've been discussing, how would you see these two aspects going hand in hand together with the compliance plus aspect that you mentioned?
I can't own that phrase. That's my husband's phrase, by the way, compliance plus. My personal opinion, this is Helen's opinion,
Yes.
It's got to be relevant to them. And one of the things that actually Kirkpatrick in their evaluation model really emphasises is relevancy. So if you talk about generic things, if you talk about case studies from Latin America or from the 1970s, actually it's very, very hard to get buy-in from the new generation. But actually, if you looked at an aircraft, that crashed 6 months ago, for example, it's still relevant and it's new. Or the same type of aircraft that you're going to be operating on, it has that relevancy. I know there's a huge thought towards the new generation liking sort of like bite-sized learning. I think there's a lot of benefits in that. Not just, I don't like using the word, but like pandering to their needs. But actually, if you have to get something that's a really, really big topic, and let's say your objective was to get that into a 25-second reel or a 2-minute YouTube short, it really forces you as the training provider to really focus on what's important here, because one of the difficulties I think we have when we're passionate about a subject is that everything is important, because you're so passionate, you want everybody to know everything, that sometimes you kind of lose the detail in the noise. And actually, by looking at developing something that is bite-sized, for example, and there's so many, multimedia opportunities and developers out there. I mean, even AI can do it for you. Let's face it, they could probably put a video together for you. But it really, really focuses you on, okay, what is the one specific thing that they need to learn from this 25-second Facebook reel, for example. And I think that can be quite powerful from an instructor's perspective as well, because it forces you to take that step back. So.
Coming back from your time when you were learning to now, do you envy what is possible today for the young individual starting off an aviation career?
Man, do I envy them? I don't know. And I say that because it's such a different world. We had a conversation earlier about going to the library, didn't we? And how that forces that sort of like that curiosity and that wider scope of thinking. And there's so much benefit to that actually being forced to read through a book or a manual or to do some research. We did have the internet when I was learning to fly. I'm not that old. But, actually having those facilities available to you sort of develop that curiosity. But I think now, even where I am at the moment in my career, when I was doing my master's degree, I learned, there was a lot of theories that I learnt about, particularly talking about, training development and stuff, that I learnt on YouTube. When I look at things like, there was an investigation process, HFACS, Human Factors Analysis Classification System. I had all my university notes and it just blew my mind. So I sat down one afternoon with a bowl of popcorn, stuck YouTube on, and I learnt it from there. So actually it really, really helps. Am I envious of them? I don't know. I don't know, because it's a different world. You've got different resources available, and I think what you've got now has a different output to what we had then. But what you need now is different to what we needed then.